The ultimate agony for Robespierre wasn't the falling blade. It was lying on the plank with a shattered jaw, forced to hear the roaring cheers of the very people he had sworn to protect. The most powerful man in France, the architect of the Reign of Terror, was finally dragged to the exact same guillotine he used to execute thousands of others. He didn't die for money or pleasure. He died for an ideal so pure and extreme that it left absolutely no room for mercy. It is hard to believe that the man who signed mass death warrants was once a gentle provincial lawyer who loved roses and was called the Incorruptible for his modest life. Robespierre's story exposes the stark reality of how thin the line is between hero and villain when faith becomes blind. A life that started with a desperate wish to free humanity ended brutally in a pool of blood, fear, and betrayal. The story of France's most controversial son begins not with fire, but with a profound, suffocating silence. Maximilien François-Marie Isidore de Robespierre was born on May 6, 1758, in Arras, a garrison town in the province of Artois. He was the eldest son of a respectable family, but respectability in the 18th century was a fragile veneer. When looking for the seeds of tyranny in the childhoods of history's dark figures, we often search for pathology, cruelty to animals, violent outbursts, or a lust for dominance. You will find none of that in the young Robespierre. Instead, you find a catastrophe of abandonment that would freeze his heart and calcify his soul. When Maximilien was just 6 years old, his world collapsed. His mother, Jacqueline, died in childbirth. She was the warmth of the home, the emotional anchor. Her death was not just a loss, it was a detonation that destroyed the family structure. His father, François, a lawyer of some standing, did not handle the grief with stoicism. He disintegrated. He spiraled into a depression so deep that he abandoned his practice, began to drink heavily, and then, in an act of supreme betrayal, simply vanished. He left Arras, left his 4 young children, and disappeared into the winds of Europe, eventually dying in obscurity in Munich. Overnight, at the tender age of 6, Maximilien ceased to be a child. He became the man of the house, a solemn little adult responsible for his brother Augustine and his sisters. He and Augustine were taken in by their maternal grandparents, but the damage was done. The lesson was seared into his consciousness, a scar that would never fade. You cannot rely on others. People leave, people die, people betray you, fathers abandon you. The only things that do not leave, the only things that remain pure and constant, are ideas, principles, virtue. He retreated inward. He became a watcher, a listener. While other boys played rough games in the streets of Arras, Maximilien sat by the window, reading. He was the good boy, the serious child who never dirtied his clothes, who pleased his elders, who sought validation through perfection. He learned that if he was perfect, if he was incorruptible in his studies and his manners, perhaps he would be safe. Perhaps he would not be abandoned again. His intellect was his shield and his weapon. He was brilliant, possessing a mind that could dissect complex arguments with surgical precision. This brilliance earned him a scholarship to the most prestigious school in France, the Lycée Louis le Grand in Paris. Arrival in Paris as a teenager was a culture shock that would sharpen his class consciousness. Louis le Grand was where the sons of the aristocracy were sent to be polished. Robespierre arrived with holes in his shoes and threadbare coats. He was the charity case, the scholarship boy surrounded by the gilded youth of the nobility. He watched them flaunt their wealth, their effortless arrogance, and their disdain for the common people. He saw the hypocrisy of a society where birth determined worth, where a foolish duke was honored like a demigod, while a brilliant commoner was expected to bow in the mud. He made few friends, but those he made were significant. One was a stuttering, fiery, chaotic boy named Camille Desmoulins. Camille was everything Robespierre was not: impulsive, emotional, messy, and loud. Yet a strange bond formed between the austere Robespierre and the wild Desmoulins, a friendship that would eventually become the deadliest tragedy of the Revolution. It was during these years at Louis-le-Grand that Robespierre found his true father figure. It was not a man he met in the flesh, but a voice he found on the page: Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The Enlightenment was sweeping through France, challenging the ancient dogmas of the church and the monarchy. But for Robespierre, Rousseau was not just a philosopher, he was a prophet. Rousseau argued that man was born good but was corrupted by society. He argued that the general will of the people was the only legitimate source of power, not the divine right of kings. He spoke of a republic of virtue where citizens were patriotic, honest, and selfless. For the lonely, impoverished student, these words were water in a desert. They offered a blueprint for a world where a boy like him, poor, virtuous, and hard-working, was superior to the lazy, decadent aristocrats who mocked his clothes. Robespierre didn't just read Rousseau, he internalized him. He began to view himself as the agent of this virtue. He believed with a frightening intensity that a utopia was possible if only the corruption could be purged. There is a famous anecdote from his school days that perfectly encapsulates the irony of his fate. In 1775, King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were returning from their coronation. They stopped at Louis-le-Grand to receive a ceremonial greeting. The school administrators chose their brightest student to read a Latin oration to the king. That student was the 17-year-old Maximilien Robespierre. The day was miserable. It was pouring rain. The king and queen remained inside their dry, opulent carriage. The young Robespierre was made to kneel in the mud, in the freezing rain, reading his speech to the closed window of the carriage. The king, bored and indifferent, barely acknowledged the boy, and as soon as the speech was done, the carriage splashed away, covering the future revolutionary in mud. The king could not have known that the shivering boy kneeling in the muck was the man who would, 18 years later, sever his head from his shoulders. It was a tableau of the old regime, the indifference of power and the humiliation of merit. By 1781, his education was complete. He returned to Arras not as a conqueror, but as a lawyer. He set up a practice in a modest house which he shared with his sister Charlotte. And here, the legend of the incorruptible began to take physical form. He was not a lawyer for the rich. He became the advocate of the downtrodden. He took cases that others refused, defending peasants against the church, protecting the poor from the arbitrary cruelty of the local nobility. He won a famous case involving a lightning rod, a new invention by Benjamin Franklin that a local resident had installed on his roof. The neighbors, terrified of this heretical science, wanted it torn down. Robespierre defended the man of science against the mob of superstition, arguing for progress and enlightenment. He won, and his name began to circulate in intellectual circles. But his life in Arras was not all political crusading. He was, by all accounts, a gentleman. He loved flowers. He kept sparrows as pets. He enjoyed singing in the local art society. He was fastidious about his appearance, always powdering his wig and brushing his coat, maintaining the dignity of a gentleman even if he lacked the funds of one. However, the defining moment of this period, the moment that hangs over his legacy like a ghost, occurred shortly after he was appointed as a judge in the criminal court of the Diocese of Arras. It was a prestigious promotion, a sign that he had made it. But with the position came a terrible responsibility. In March 1782, a case came across his desk. A man had been convicted of murder. The evidence was irrefutable. The law was clear. The punishment was death by hanging. Robespierre sat in his chambers, staring at the death warrant. His hand trembled. He was physically ill. The abstract idea of justice was one thing, but the reality of ordering the state to extinguish a human life was something his soul could not metabolize. He believed that the death penalty was a barbarism, a stain on civilization. He argued that a society that kills its own citizens is no better than the criminals it seeks to punish. He could not do it. He signed the warrant because the law demanded it. But the act broke him. He went home and collapsed in a paroxysm of grief and guilt. He told his sister he could not bear the weight of blood on his conscience. Shortly after, he resigned his judgeship. He walked away from his career rather than be a part of the machinery of death. Hold this image in your mind. Freeze it there. The young man, pale and shaking, resigning his post because his heart is too tender to permit the execution of a single guilty murderer. It is a long, winding, and blood-soaked road from that quiet chamber in Arras to the guillotine in Paris. But the journey had begun. The forces of history were gathering like storm clouds over France. The treasury was empty, bankrupt by wars in America and the excesses of Versailles. The people were starving, spending 90% of their income on bread that was filled with sawdust. The tension was unbearable. In 1789, the king, desperate for money, did something that hadn't been done in over 100 years. He summoned the Estates General. He called for representatives from the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners to come to Versailles to solve the crisis. Robespierre campaigned for a seat. He wrote furious pamphlets, railing against the corruption of the local potentates. The people of Arras, recognizing their defender, elected him. He packed his trunk. He took his few coats, his books of Rousseau, and his unyielding ideals. He boarded the coach for Versailles, leaving behind the quiet provincial life he would never see again. He was 31 years old. He was a nobody, a small, anxious lawyer from the north with a high-pitched voice and a twitch in his eye. When he arrived at the glittering palace of Versailles, walking amidst the giants of the age, no one looked at him twice. No one knew his name. No one suspected that inside this slight, unassuming figure lay a will of iron that would soon bring the entire kingdom crashing down. The shadow had arrived at the Sun King's palace, and he brought the darkness with him. The journey from the quiet cobblestones of Arras to the gilded gates of Versailles was more than a physical relocation. It was a descent into the very heart of the beast Robespierre would eventually slay. He arrived carrying the naive hope that the Estates General would be a meeting of minds, a place where reason would triumph over rank. But as the coach wheels ground to a halt and the splendor of the Sun King's palace rose before him, the stark reality of the old regime made itself immediately and painfully clear. The stage was set not for a debate, but for a class war, and the battle lines were drawn the moment he stepped off the carriage. Versailles in May of 1789 was a theater of humiliation designed by centuries of tradition. When the Estates General finally convened, the optics were deliberately arranged to remind everyone of their place in the cosmic hierarchy. The clergy sat in their resplendent robes. The nobility were draped in gold embroidery, feathers and silk shimmering like peacocks. And then there was the third estate, the lawyers, the merchants, the representatives of the 96% of the population who actually worked and paid taxes. By royal decree, they were forced to wear stark, somber black to mark their inferiority. They looked like a flock of crows intentionally placed amidst a gathering of birds of paradise. Maximilien Robespierre was lost in this sea of black cloth. He was one of nearly 600 deputies of the Third Estate, and certainly one of the least impressive. When he first stood to speak in the cavernous hall of Menu Plaisir, his voice was barely a whisper against the acoustic cavern. He was nervous. His hands shook as he held his meticulously written speeches. He had a habit of pushing his spectacles up his nose, a tic that betrayed his anxiety. The aristocrats in the gallery chatted amongst themselves, ignoring him. Even his fellow commoners found him tedious. He lacked the thunderous lion-like roar of Mirabeau or the earthy magnetic charm of Danton. Robespierre was dry, legalistic, and pedantic. He spoke of virtue and principles, while others spoke of power and money. The newspapers of the time barely mentioned his name, often misspelling it as Robespierre or Robespierre. He was a ghost in the machine of history, a man seemingly destined to be a footnote, but they had underestimated his stamina. While the other deputies spent their nights drinking in the taverns of Versailles or courting the favor of powerful salons, Robespierre went back to his small rented room and wrote. He wrote furiously, drafting speech after speech, refining his logic until it was razor sharp. He didn't care if they listened. He didn't care if they laughed. He believed he was speaking the truth, and the truth did not require applause to be valid. He was present at the tennis court oath in June, standing amidst the soaking wet deputies who had been locked out of their meeting hall by the king. In that indoor tennis court, smelling of damp wool and revolutionary fervor, they swore not to disband until they had given France a constitution. Robespierre's signature is there on the document, a small, neat script amidst the scrawls of history's giants. It was the moment the lawyers became revolutionaries. As the summer of 1789 heated up, and the Bastille fell on July 14th, shattering the illusion of royal invincibility, Robespierre's demeanor began to change. The violence of the mob, which terrified many of the moderate deputies, did not appall him. Instead, he justified it. When the governor of the Bastille was hacked to death and his head paraded on a pike, Robespierre saw it not as murder, but as the people's justice. Is there anything legitimate in the eyes of tyrants? He asked. He was beginning to formulate the dangerous idea that would define his life, that the violence of the oppressor is a crime, but the violence of the oppressed is a necessity. By 1790, the government had moved to Paris, and the dynamic of the revolution shifted. The National Assembly was no longer a debate club. It was the engine of a new world. And slowly the man in green, as he was sometimes called due to his favorite olive-colored coat, began to attract a following. It wasn't his charisma that drew people to him. It was his consistency. In a city awash with corruption, where deputies were secretly taking bribes from the king or plotting with foreign powers, Robespierre was terrifyingly transparent. He lived in a single room in the house of Maurice Duplay, a carpenter. The Duplays adored him. They treated him like a living saint. He ate dinner with them every night, simple meals of soup and bread. He never drank alcohol. He never visited brothels. He had no debts. This lifestyle earned him the nickname that would become his shield and his weapon, l'incorruptible, the incorruptible. While Mirabeau was secretly meeting with the Queen and Danton was accepting money from mysterious sources, Robespierre stood at the podium and demanded things that seemed insane to the establishment, but thrilled the common people. He was decades, sometimes centuries, ahead of his time. He argued for universal male suffrage, the radical idea that a poor man's vote was worth the same as a rich man's. He fought for the rights of Jews and Protestants to hold office. He demanded that actors be allowed to be buried in church cemeteries. And most passionately, he railed against slavery in the French colonies. "You urge us to keep the slave trade because it is in the national interest," he shouted at the assembly, his voice cracking with emotion. I say, let the colonies perish rather than a principle. It is vital to pause here and recognize the profound irony. The man who would later become the face of the terror was, at this stage, the most humanitarian voice in France. He was the conscience of the revolution. He even proposed a bill to abolish the death penalty, arguing that a winner who kills his enemies is a coward. The proposal was rejected, but the fact that he made it haunts the history books. He was a man of supreme empathy who was slowly being hardened by the fires of political betrayal. The betrayal that finally broke the last remnants of his moderation came in June 1791. For 2 years, the revolution had been trying to create a constitutional monarchy. The idea was that King Louis XVI would remain as a figurehead, a father of the nation, while the Assembly made the laws. Robespierre had been skeptical, but he had played along. He wanted to believe that the king could be a citizen. Then came the flight to Varennes. On the night of June 20th, the king and queen dressed in disguise, Louis as a valet, Marie Antoinette as a governess, and slipped out of the Tuileries Palace under the cover of darkness. They fled toward the Austrian border, intending to link up with foreign armies and march back to Paris to crush the revolution by force. They were caught in the small town of Varennes, recognized by a postmaster from the profile on a coin. They were hauled back to Paris in a funeral procession of silence. The people did not cheer. They did not jeer. They stared. The bond between king and subject was severed forever. For Robespierre, this was the moment the world turned black and white. There were no longer misguided royals or confused aristocrats. There were only patriots and traitors. The king had lied. The king had plotted to kill his own people. If the father could betray the children, then no one could be trusted. Paranoia, cold and logical, began to take root in Robespierre's mind. He realized that the revolution was not a debate, it was a war. The political landscape fractured. The moderates tried to cover up the king's escape, claiming he had been kidnapped to avoid a civil war. Robespierre saw this for what it was, a lie to protect the monarchy. He went to the Jacobin Club, a debating society that was rapidly becoming the heartbeat of radical Paris, and gave a speech that electrified the room. He declared that he did not fear death, but he would not be silent about this treason. I am not the defender of the people, he said. I am of the people. I have never been anything else, and I want only to be that. It was at the Jacobin Club that Robespierre found his true power. In the assembly, he was one of many. But in the Jacobin Club, under the low ceilings and amidst the smoke of tobacco pipes, he was the high priest. He purged the club of moderates. He demanded absolute loyalty to the principles of the revolution. He began to build a political machine that would eventually consume France. By 1792, the drums of war were beating. The other European monarchies, Austria, Prussia, Spain, were terrified that the French plague of democracy would spread. Inside France, a faction called the Girondins wanted war. They believed a war would unite the country and force the king to show his true colors. They dreamed of a crusade to spread liberty across Europe. Robespierre stood alone against the war fever. In one of his most prescient moments, he warned the Jacobins that war would be the death of liberty. He predicted that it would lead to a military dictatorship, a prophecy that would be fulfilled years later by Napoleon. He mocked the idea that foreign nations would welcome French troops with open arms. The most extravagant idea that can arise in a politician's head, he sneered, is to believe that it is enough for a people to invade a foreign country to make it adopt their laws and their constitution. No one loves armed missionaries. He was right, but he was ignored. France declared war on Austria in April 1792. It was a disaster. The French army, disorganized and leaderless, since most of the officers were aristocrats who had fled, collapsed. The Austrians and Prussians marched toward Paris. Their commander, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a manifesto threatening to burn Paris to the ground if the king was harmed. This threat backfired spectacularly. Instead of cowing the Parisians, it enraged them. It proved exactly what Robespierre had been saying. The king was in league with the enemy. On August 10, 1792, the pressure cooker exploded. A massive mob of sans-culottes, the radical working class, and federal troops stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king's Swiss guards were massacred. Louis XVI fled to the Assembly for protection, but the monarchy was effectively dead. Robespierre did not lead the charge on the palace. He was not a man of physical action, but he had loaded the gun. His speeches had defined the enemy. Now the people had pulled the trigger. In the chaotic weeks that followed, Paris descended into hysteria. With the foreign armies closing in, a terrifying rumor spread that the prisons of Paris were full of royalists and priests who were planning to break out and massacre the families of the revolutionaries while the men were at the front. What happened next is the dark stain that signals the beginning of the end of humanity in the revolution. The September massacres. For 5 days, mobs broke into the prisons. They set up kangaroo courts. They hacked to death over 1,000 prisoners, priests, aristocrats, but also common thieves, prostitutes, and children. The streets literally ran with blood. Robespierre did not wield a knife. He did not issue the order, but he did not stop it. In the aftermath, he refused to condemn the violence. He saw it as a regrettable but necessary cleansing. "Do you want a revolution without a revolution?" he asked his critics. He was beginning to accept that the birth of the Republic required a baptism of blood. The king was deposed. The Republic was declared. A new calendar was invented starting with year 1 to signify that history had begun anew. And Maximilien Robespierre, the small lawyer from Arras, was elected to the new National Convention with the highest number of votes of any deputy in Paris. He was no longer a voice in the wilderness. He was now the voice of the nation. But a massive looming question remained, a question that would tear the convention apart and set Robespierre on a collision course with his own soul. What to do with the man who used to be king? Louis Capet sat in a grim tower known as the Temple, stripping away the last of his royal dignity, awaiting judgment. The moderates wanted to save him. Robespierre knew that as long as the king lived, the Republic was in danger. The incorruptible checked his conscience, looked into the abyss, and prepared to demand the head of the man who had once let him kneel in the rain. This decision marked the final shedding of the skin of the provincial lawyer. The hesitation that had once stayed his hand in the Arras courthouse was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve forged in the fires of betrayal. Robespierre realized that the revolution could not coexist with a living symbol of the past. To build the new world, the old one didn't just need to be defeated, it needed to be decapitated. As the year turned, the temperature in Paris dropped, mirroring the chilling hardening of Robespierre's own heart. The winter of 1792 was one of the coldest in living memory. The Seine froze solid, and the poor of Paris shivered in their garrets, wrapping their feet in rags, waiting for the revolution to deliver the bread it had promised. But inside the National Convention, the air was hot with the friction of a debate that would define the soul of the new republic. The question on every lip, the dilemma that kept the deputies awake at night, was the fate of the man now known simply as Citizen Louis Capet. for the moderate faction, the Girondins. The solution was legalistic and cautious. They wanted a trial. They wanted a referendum. They wanted to exile the king to America or keep him as a hostage against the foreign armies. They were terrified of the consequences of regicide. They knew that killing the king would unite every monarch in Europe against France in a war of annihilation. They spoke of mercy, of procedure, of the judgment of history. But Maximilien Robespierre was done with the law. He had moved beyond the courtroom logic of Arras. He was operating now on the brutal calculus of survival. On December 3, 1792, he ascended the podium to deliver a speech that effectively signed the king's death warrant, and in doing so, laid the intellectual foundation for the terror that was to follow. He did not shout. He did not wave his arms. He adjusted his glasses, looked out at the sea of faces, and spoke with a terrifying, icy clarity. "Louis must die," he told them, "so that the country may live." His argument was a masterpiece of revolutionary logic. He told the deputies that they were not judges, and Louis was not a defendant. A trial presumes the possibility of innocence, but if Louis could be innocent, then the revolution itself might be guilty. If the king was not a tyrant, then the people who overthrew him were criminals. To hold a trial was to put the revolution itself in the dock. "You do not have a verdict to give for or against a man," Robespierre said, "but a measure of public safety to take." It was a devastating point. Robespierre was forcing them to choose. Either the king was guilty and must die, or the republic was a lie. He, the man who had once resigned his job rather than sign a death warrant for a murderer, was now demanding the head of a king without even the pretense of a legal defense. The transformation was nearly complete. The lawyer had become the executioner. On January 20th, 1793, the convention voted. By a narrow margin, the king was condemned to death. The next morning, January 21st, was damp and foggy. A carriage rolled through the streets of Paris, surrounded by a forest of bayonets. Louis XVI, displaying a dignity in death that he had often lacked in life, climbed the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. He tried to speak to the crowd, to forgive his enemies, but the commander of the National Guard ordered the drums to roll, drowning out the monarch's last words. The blade fell. The executioner lifted the severed head by the hair and showed it to the silent crowd. A cry went up, "Vive la République!" But beneath the cheers there was a shudder. They had done the unthinkable. They had killed the father. There was no going back. The bridges were burned. France was now an island of republicanism in a sea of hostile monarchies. And every man who had voted for the king's death knew that if the republic fell, they would all hang. Robespierre watched it all, his face a mask. He knew what was coming. The execution of the king did not bring peace, it brought hell. By the spring of 1793, France was collapsing. As the Girondins had feared, the death of Louis united Europe. Britain, Spain, and Holland joined the war against France. The French armies were defeated and pushed back. General Dumouriez, a hero of the early war, defected to the Austrians, a betrayal that convinced Robespierre that military men could never be trusted. But the real threat was internal. In the western region of the Vendée, a massive peasant uprising exploded. Fueled by anger over the draft and loyalty to the Catholic Church, the Vendéan rebels massacred local revolutionaries. It was a civil war of unspeakable brutality. At the same time, the economy imploded. The value of the assignat, the revolutionary currency, plummeted. The price of bread skyrocketed. The sans-culottes in Paris were starving again, and they were angry. They blamed the moderate Girondins who controlled the government for the high prices and the military defeats. Robespierre saw his moment. He had come to despise the Girondins. He saw them not just as political opponents, but as obstacles to the survival of the nation. They talked of the rule of law while the country was burning. They were too soft, too elite, too disconnected from the suffering of the poor. Robespierre, the man who lived in a carpenter's house, felt the pulse of the streets. He knew the people wanted blood and bread. On May 31st and June 2nd, 1793, Robespierre orchestrated a coup d'etat within the parliament. He didn't use the army, he used the mob. 80,000 armed sans-culottes surrounded the convention, aiming their cannons at the doors. They demanded the arrest of the Girondin leaders. The deputies, trapped and terrified, voted to arrest 29 of their own colleagues. It was the death of the first French democracy. The convention was no longer a free parliament. It was a hostage to the radical will of the Paris Commune and the Jacobins. The Girondins were dragged away, destined for the guillotine. Robespierre was now the master of the convention. To manage this crisis, to fight a five-front war and a civil war simultaneously, the convention created a new executive body, the Committee of Public Safety. At first, Danton led it, but Danton was lazy, corrupt, and prone to negotiation. He failed to stop the chaos. In July 1793, Danton was voted out, and Maximilien Robespierre was voted in. He walked into the committee's meeting room, the Green Room in the Tuileries, and effectively shut the door on the rest of the world. There were 12 men on the committee. They were known as the 12 who ruled. They were a strange mix: the icy Robespierre, the youthful and fanatical Saint-Just, the crippled mastermind Couthon, the brilliant organizer Carnot. They worked 18 hours a day around a green table fueled by coffee and desperation. They had absolute power. They controlled the armies, the police, the economy, and the guillotine. Robespierre was not the dictator in title. Decisions had to be collective, but he was the dictator in spirit. He provided the ideology. He was the moral compass, and that compass was pointing directly into the dark. Just as Robespierre took power, an event occurred that validated all his darkest paranoias. Jean-Paul Marat, the fiery journalist who had called for thousands of heads, the friend of the people, was sitting in his medicinal bath. He had a debilitating skin condition when a young woman named Charlotte Corday gained entry to his room. Corday was a Girondin sympathizer from the provinces. She believed that Marat was a monster responsible for the Civil War. She pulled a 6-inch kitchen knife from her dress and plunged it into Marat's chest. He died instantly, the water in the tub turning the color of crimson wine. The assassination of Marat sent a shockwave through Paris. To the Jacobins, it was proof that the enemies within were everywhere. If a young, beautiful woman could be a counter-revolutionary assassin, then who could be trusted? No one. Robespierre seized on the mood. Marat was martyred, his body displayed like a religious relic. But Robespierre used his death to argue that weakness and mercy were fatal errors. The Republic was being stabbed in the heart because it had been too lenient. Terror, Robespierre declared to the convention, is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. Read those words again. He didn't see terror as a necessary evil. He saw it as a form of virtue. To him, mercy to a traitor was cruelty to the people. If you spare the wolf, you kill the sheep. Therefore, the most virtuous thing a man could do was to suppress his human instinct for pity and strike down the enemies of the state. On September 5th, 1793, the convention formally voted to make terror the order of the day. The law of suspects was passed. It was a terrifyingly vague piece of legislation. It allowed for the arrest of anyone who, by their conduct, their connections, their words, or even their writings, showed themselves to be enemies of liberty. You could be arrested for hoarding bread. You could be arrested for calling someone monsieur instead of citizen. You could be arrested for not looking happy enough when a revolutionary parade went by. The spies were everywhere. The concierge of your building, your waiter, your own brother, anyone could denounce you to the revolutionary tribunal. The machine was built. The prisons began to fill up. The tumbrils, the wooden carts that carried the condemned, began their daily rattle over the cobblestones. Robespierre, the man who loved flowers and chamber music, now presided over a system of industrial slaughter. But he did not see himself as a butcher. In his mind, he was the great gardener. He was weeding the garden of the Republic, the aristocracy, the corrupt politicians, the hoarders, the spies. They were the weeds choking the flower of liberty. They had to be pulled out by the roots. His first major target was the ultimate symbol of the old world, the widow Capet, Marie Antoinette. The former queen had been held in the conciergerie prison, separated from her children. Her hair turned white from grief. On October 14th, 1793, she was put on trial. It was a show trial, a farce. They accused her of treason, of depleting the treasury, and in a final act of depravity, they accused her of incest with her young son. Robespierre watched from the shadows. He knew the incest charge was a lie, a filthy fabrication by the extremist Hébert, but he said nothing. The verdict was preordained. On October 16th, Marie Antoinette was driven to the scaffold. Unlike her husband, she was given a common open cart, forcing her to endure the insults of the mob. She sat straight-backed, proud to the end. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and apologized. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." They were her last words. The queen's head fell, but it wasn't enough. The hunger of the guillotine was insatiable. The terror turned inward. It was no longer just about killing royalists. It was about purifying the revolution itself. Robespierre began to look at his colleagues on the benches of the convention. He saw corruption. He saw ambition. He saw men who used the revolution to get rich, men who drank too much, men who lacked virtue. He began to keep a notebook. In it, he wrote the names of those he suspected. He carried it with him everywhere. The deputies would watch him writing, sweating in their coats, wondering if their name was being inscribed in the book of the dead. As the winter of 1793 approached, a new darker chill settled over Paris. The incorruptible had become the Terminator. He had successfully consolidated power. He had crushed the Girondins. He had executed the king and queen. He had silenced the opposition. But victory did not bring him peace. It only brought paranoia. He stopped sleeping. His eyes became sunken, his skin pale and pasty. He began to see conspiracy in the way a man looked at him in the whisper of a conversation in the hallway. He was trapped in a loop of his own making. To be safe, he had to kill the enemies. But every time he killed, he created more enemies, which meant he had to kill more. He was riding a tiger. He dared not dismount. And as the year 2 dawned, Robespierre prepared to do the unthinkable. He prepared to turn the blade against his own friends. The revolution was like Saturn, devouring its own children, and Robespierre was the mouth. Having devoured the monarchy and the moderate opposition, the insatiable hunger of the terror now turned inward. The circle of trust, which had once encompassed the entire Third Estate, had shrunk to a terrified few within the committee itself. Robespierre found himself standing on a lonely summit, the air thin and cold, looking down at the fracture lines spreading through the foundation of his own party. The incorruptible was about to face the ultimate test of his ideology. Could he justify the slaughter of the very men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the trenches of liberty? By the winter of 1794, the snow that blanketed Paris was gray with soot, and the mood of the city was brittle with fear. The revolution had survived its infancy, but it was now entering its adolescence, violent, unpredictable, and prone to self-mutilation. Maximilien Robespierre sat at the center of this storm, in his small room at the Dupleix house, shivering despite the fire. He was no longer just a politician. He was the high priest of a terrified nation. But as he looked out at the political landscape, he did not see victory. He saw two heads of a hydra rising to consume his republic of virtue. The danger was no longer the royalists. They were dead or in exile. The danger now came from within the revolutionary family itself. The Jacobin Club had fractured into two warring factions, and Robespierre stood paralyzed in the middle, detesting them both. On his left were the Hébertists, led by Jacques Hébert, the foul-mouthed editor of the radical newspaper Le Père Duchesne. These were the ultras. They were violent atheists who believed the revolution hadn't gone far enough. They wanted to de-Christianize France entirely. They smashed statues of saints, turned Notre Dame Cathedral into a temple of reason, and held mock ceremonies where they drank wine out of chalices and danced in church vestments. To Robespierre, a man of deep, if unorthodox faith who believed that atheism was a vice of the aristocracy, this was repugnant. It was chaos. It was immorality masquerading as liberty. On his right were the Indulgents, led by the titan of the revolution, Georges Danton. If Robespierre was the mind of the revolution, Danton was its body, massive, scarred, loud, a drinker, a womanizer, a man of immense physical appetites and undeniable charisma. Danton had grown tired of the blood. He had married a young 16-year-old girl and wanted to retire to his farm. He looked at the guillotine and saw a machine that had outlived its purpose. "I would rather be guillotined than be a guillotiner," he famously spat. Beside him was Camille Desmoulins, Robespierre's childhood friend from Louis le Grand, the boy who had once made him laugh. Desmoulins had started a newspaper, Le Vieux Cordelier, arguing for a committee of clemency. He called for an end to the terror. Robespierre was cornered. If he let the Hébertists live, they would plunge France into anarchy and turn the people against the revolution through their grotesque atheism. If he listened to Danton and stopped the terror, he believed the royalists would return, the discipline would collapse, and the republic would fall to foreign armies. In his mind, there was only one path, the path of virtue. And virtue required the elimination of both vices. He decided to strike. He moved against the Hébertists first. It was a surgical operation. In March 1794, utilizing the terrifying power of the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre denounced Hébert and his followers as foreign agents. The trial was a formality. On March 24th, the ultras were packed into the tumbrils. Hébert, the man who had mocked the king and queen, fainted several times on the way to the scaffold. The blade fell. The left wing of the opposition was gone. But now came the true test, the test that would tear Robespierre's soul apart. To balance the scales, to prove that his virtue was impartial, he had to strike the right. He had to kill Danton. This was not like killing the king or Hébert. Danton was a hero of the Republic. He was the man who had rallied the country in 1792 with the cry, "Audacity, more audacity, always audacity." More than that, Danton was a comrade. And Camille Desmoulins. Camille was family. Robespierre had been a witness at Camille's wedding. He was the godfather to Camille's son, little Horace. He had bounced the boy on his knee. For days Robespierre agonized. He fell ill, refusing to eat. Mutual friends tried to arrange a meeting between the two titans to reconcile them. They met at a dinner. Danton, drunk and reckless, poured wine and told Robespierre to stop the killing. "You cannot drink the blood of humanity forever, Maximilien," he roared. Robespierre, cold and sober, asked, "Who told you that innocent men are dying?" Danton laughed in his face. "Innocent? You say there are no innocent men dying? Not one?" He mocked Robespierre's prudishness, his rigidity. Robespierre left the dinner in silence. Danton's fate was sealed. The incorruptible had decided that friendship was a weakness. If he spared Danton because they were friends, he was corrupt. Therefore, to prove his purity, Danton had to die. On the night of March 30th, 1794, the order was signed. Robespierre's hand shook, but he signed it. Danton was warned that they were coming for him. "They will not dare," he muttered, staring into the fire. But they did dare. In the pre-dawn darkness, the gendarmes kicked down his door. Danton, Desmoulins, and their supporters were dragged to the Luxembourg prison. The trial of the Dantonists was the most dramatic spectacle of the Revolution. Danton did not defend himself. He attacked. His voice was so loud it could be heard through the open windows of the courthouse across the Seine, by the crowds gathering on the bridges. He put the committee on trial. He made the jurors weep. He made the audience cheer. For a moment, it looked like Danton's sheer force of personality would topple the government. Robespierre was terrified. He refused to attend the trial, hiding in his room, claiming illness. But he sent his angel of death, the icy 26-year-old Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, to the convention. Saint-Just told the deputies that Danton's resistance was proof of his guilt. He pushed through a decree silencing the prisoners. Danton and Desmoulins were barred from speaking in their own defense. When the verdict of death was read, Danton rose and pointed a finger toward the direction of Robespierre's house. "Vile Robespierre," he bellowed, "the scaffold claims you too. You will follow me." On April 5th, 1794, the Dantonists were carted to the guillotine. It was a beautiful spring day. The lilacs were in bloom. Desmoulins was sobbing, screaming out the name of his wife, Lucille, tearing his shirt in a frenzy of grief. Danton sat next to him, stoic and massive. "Quiet, boy," he said gently. "It will be over soon." When they reached the scaffold, Danton looked at the executioner and delivered one of the most famous exit lines in history. "Show my head to the people," he said. "It is worth seeing." The blade fell on the neck of the man who saved France. Moments later, it fell on the neck of Robespierre's best friend. Robespierre was now the undisputed master of France. The opposition was dead. The Committee of Public Safety was supreme. But the death of Danton had changed the atmosphere in Paris. The joy was gone. The patriotic fervor was replaced by a sullen, silent dread. If Danton could die, no one was safe. Robespierre, isolated in his power, retreated further into his own mind. He became obsessed with the idea that the revolution needed a spiritual center. He believed that the chaos of the past years was due to a lack of morality. Atheism was the problem. The people needed God, not the Catholic God of the priests and the Pope, but a supreme being of nature and reason. He convinced the convention to pass a decree recognizing the existence of the supreme being and the immortality of the soul. On June 8th, 1794, 20 Prairial, he staged the festival of the supreme being. It was Robespierre's apotheosis. Paris was decorated with flowers. A massive artificial mountain was built on the Champ de Mars. Robespierre, dressed in a coat of sky blue silk and holding a bouquet of wheat and flowers marched far ahead of the other deputies. He looked like a prophet leading his people to the promised land. He climbed the mountain and delivered a sermon on virtue. To the common people, it was a beautiful day of rest and celebration. But to the hardened politicians of the convention, walking sullenly behind him, it was a display of megalomania. They muttered under their breath. "Look at the little bantam rooster," one whispered. "He is not satisfied being master. He wants to be God." It was the peak of his power, but it was a fragile summit. Robespierre failed to notice that while the people cheered the festival, they were weary of the guillotine. He thought the festival marked the beginning of a new golden age. In reality, it marked the beginning of the end. 2 days later, on June 10th, Robespierre pushed through the law of 22 Prairial. It is known to history as the Law of the Great Terror. Robespierre believed that the courts were moving too slowly. There were still too many enemies. The new law stripped prisoners of the right to a defense counsel. It removed the need for witnesses. It allowed juries to convict based on moral proof, essentially gut feeling. And it reduced the possible verdicts to 2, acquittal or death. The result was an assembly line of slaughter. In the 6 weeks following the law, known as the Great Terror, over 1,300 people were beheaded in Paris alone. The guillotine was moved to the eastern edge of the city because the ground at the previous site had become so saturated with blood that it was a health hazard. The executioners complained of exhaustion. The blades grew dull. Robespierre stopped attending the convention. He stopped attending the committee meetings. He stayed in his room at the Duplay house, exhausted, paranoid, and physically deteriorating. He had crushed the external enemies. He had crushed the internal factions. But the Republic of Virtue was not appearing. The people were not becoming purer. They were just becoming quieter. The paranoia was no longer a shadow. It was a blinding light. He saw specific daggers in the eyes of men like Fouché and Tallien. He realized these men weren't plotting against his policies. They were plotting for their own survival. July 1794 arrived. The heat was oppressive. The air in Paris was thick and stagnant. Robespierre made a fatal calculation. He decided to launch one final purge, one last great cleansing to remove the final weeds from the garden, after which, surely, the era of peace would begin. On July 26th, 8 Thermidor, he returned to the convention. He walked to the podium, his face pale, his eyes behind his tinted glasses unreadable. The deputies fell silent. They knew that when Robespierre spoke, the tumbrils followed. He spoke for 2 hours. It was a rambling, confused, terrifying speech. He claimed that there was a criminal coalition within the government. He claimed there were traitors in the Committee of Public Safety, in the Committee of General Security, and in the convention itself. He railed against the monsters who were ruining the Republic. Then he made the mistake that cost him his life. "Name them," a deputy shouted from the back. "Name the accused." Robespierre paused. He looked out at the sea of faces, men he had worked with, men he had intimidated, men who were sweating with fear. "I will not name them yet," he said, or he implied it. He refused to give a list. A chill went through the room. By refusing to name the traitors, he had threatened everyone. Every man in the hall, from the corrupt Fouché to the moderate Boissy d'Anglas, thought, "He means me. I am on the list for tomorrow." That night, the fear turned into action. The disparate enemies of Robespierre, the ultra-radicals, the moderates, the corrupt, the fearful, bound themselves together in a pact of survival. They spent the night running from door to door, whispering, organizing, planning. They knew they had only one chance. They had to strike before he did. Robespierre went home to the Duplays. He walked in the garden under the moonlight. He told the Duplay family, I expect no justice from the wicked." He seemed to know the end was coming. He spoke of death not with fear, but with a strange martyred acceptance. He believed he was the Christ of the revolution, about to be sacrificed by the Pharisees. The sun rose on the 9th of Thermidor. The day was hot and humid. A storm was brewing in the sky, mirroring the storm in the convention. Robespierre dressed in his sky-blue coat, the same one he had worn at the festival of the Supreme Being. He adjusted his powdered wig. He walked to the Tuileries for the last time. He entered the hall expecting to dictate terms. He did not know that he was walking into a trap. The lion was old, tired, and alone, and the pack was waiting. The threshold of the convention, usually the stage for his greatest triumphs, had transformed overnight into the jaws of a trap. Robespierre stepped through the doors, believing he still held the thunderbolts of Jove, unaware that the fear he had cultivated had finally curdled into a weapon against him. The silence that usually greeted his arrival was absent, replaced by a vibrating tension that signaled the breaking of the storm. The hunter had unknowingly become the prey, and as the session began, the time for speeches was over. The time for survival had begun. The morning of the 9th of Thermidor, July 27, 1794, broke with a heat that was suffocating. The air in the salle de machine, where the convention met, was stagnant, smelling of unwashed bodies, old wood, and fear. The galleries were packed. The deputies sat on their benches, shifting uncomfortably, eyes darting back and forth, checking to see who was sitting with whom, calculating the odds of survival. At noon, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just took the podium. He was Robespierre's youngest and most fanatical disciple, the Angel of Death, known for his cold beauty and his lethal eloquence. Usually when Saint-Just spoke, the room fell into a terrified silence. But not today. He had barely spoken 2 sentences when Tallien, a corrupt deputy who knew he was on Robespierre's death list, jumped up. "I ask that the veil be torn away entirely," he shouted. It was the signal. Suddenly the hall erupted. It was a choreographed explosion. Every time Saint-Just tried to speak, they drowned him out. Robespierre, seeing his protégé silenced, rushed to the rostrum. He tried to take command, to use that sharp, legalistic voice that had dominated France for 2 years. "Mr. President of Deputies," he yelled, but the president of the convention, Thuriot, was part of the plot. He rang his bell frantically, the metallic clang drowning out Robespierre's words. "Down with the tyrant!" the deputy screamed. "Death to the tyrant!" Robespierre turned to the right, to the moderates, the plain, appealing to their sense of justice. They turned their faces away. He turned to the left, to the radicals. They jeered at him. He was alone in a coliseum of wolves. He tried to speak again, but his voice cracked and failed him. He sputtered, choking on his own rage and exhaustion. "The blood of Danton chokes you," a deputy named Garnier shouted from the back benches. It was a lethal strike. The ghost of his murdered friend had returned to haunt him. Robespierre stared at them, his glasses flashing in the light. "Is it Danton you regret?" he shot back. "Cowards! Why didn't you defend him then?" It was his last coherent argument. The mood was hysterical. Tallien waved a dagger in the air, threatening to kill himself if the new Cromwell was not arrested. A motion was put forward. Arrest Robespierre. Arrest Saint-Just. Arrest Couthon. Robespierre's younger brother, Augustin, stood up. "I am as guilty as my brother," he declared. "I wish to share his fate." It was a noble, tragic gesture. The convention obliged him. The vote was unanimous. The incorruptible and his lieutenants were taken into custody. As the gendarmes led him away, Robespierre muttered, "The Republic is a lost cause. The brigands have triumphed." But the drama was far from over. Paris was a city of 2 powers, the Convention, the government, and the Commune, the city hall, controlled by Robespierre's supporters. When the news of the arrest spread, the Commune rang the tocsin, the alarm bells. They called out the National Guard. In a bizarre twist of fate, the jailers at the prisons refused to accept Robespierre. They recognized him as the leader of the revolution and were too terrified to lock him up. By evening, Robespierre and his allies were free men again, gathered at the Hôtel de Ville, City Hall. This was the decisive moment. Outside on the Place de Grève, thousands of armed troops loyal to Robespierre were gathering. They had cannons. They were waiting for one thing, an order. If Robespierre signed a decree calling for an insurrection, his troops could march on the convention, slaughter his enemies, and install him as the absolute dictator of France. Henriot, the commander of the National Guard, was drunk and shouting for action. Saint-Just urged him to sign. Couthon, in his wheelchair, urged him to sign. But Robespierre sat at a desk, frozen. Why? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it shock? Was it exhaustion? Or was it his fatal flaw, his obsession with the law? Robespierre was a lawyer. He believed in the general will. To lead a military coup against the elected convention was illegal. It was tyranny. He had spent his life fighting against tyrants. He could not bring himself to become one, even to save his life. He sat there for hours, debating the legality of the move while the rain began to pour outside. The storm was violent. The troops, soaked to the bone, leaderless and confused by the silence from City Hall, began to drift away. They went home to their beds. By 2 a.m., the square was empty. Robespierre had missed his chance. At the convention, they did not hesitate. They declared Robespierre and his followers outlaws. This meant they could be executed without trial. They organized a column of troops under Paul Barras to storm City Hall. The end came in a rush of noise and violence. The convention's troops burst into the room where the Jacobins were gathered. It was a scene of pandemonium. Lebas, a loyal friend, pulled out a pistol and blew his brains out. Augustin Robespierre threw himself out of the window, shattering his legs on the cobblestones below, but surviving. Couthon, the cripple, was dragged to the staircase and thrown down head first, his body smashing helplessly against the stone steps. And Maximilien? He was sitting at the table, perhaps finally signing the call to arms. A paper was found later with the signature Ro, cut short. A pistol shot rang out. Some say a gendarme named Merda fired it. Others say Robespierre, realizing all was lost, tried to shoot himself through the mouth, aiming for the brain, but flinched. The ball entered his left cheek and shattered his jaw, knocking out teeth and detaching the bone. He did not die. He fell forward, bleeding profusely. The voice that had commanded the nation, the voice that had preached virtue and terror, was silenced forever by a piece of lead. The next 16 hours were a calvary of unimaginable suffering. They dragged him, bleeding and semi-conscious, back to the Tuileries Palace. They laid him on a table in the antechamber of the Committee of Public Safety. It was the very room where he had ruled France. Now he was a curiosity, a broken trophy. He lay there for hours, his jaw hung loose, held on only by a white bandage wrapped around his head. He was wearing his sky-blue coat, now caked in dark blood. The other deputies, men who had trembled before him yesterday, now came to stare. They mocked him. They spat on the floor near him. "Your Majesty seems to be suffering," one sneered. Robespierre said nothing. He could not speak. He only stared at the ceiling with those sea-green eyes, unblinking. Occasionally, he used a small leather pouch to wipe the bloody foam from his lips. He did not groan. He did not beg. He accepted his martyrdom with a terrifying stoicism. At one point, a doctor was brought in, not to save him, but to bandage him up so he would be alive for the guillotine. The doctor pulled teeth from the shattered jaw and dressed the wound. Robespierre didn't flinch. On the afternoon of 10th Thermidor, July 28th, the procession began. It was a carnival. The crowds were enormous, larger than for the king's execution. The people of Paris were tired of the blood, tired of the fear, and they blamed it all on this one man. Robespierre was loaded into a tumbril with 21 of his followers. He was leaning against the side of the cart, his eyes closed. The ride to the scaffold took hours. The mob danced around the cart. They shouted insults. They threw mud. A woman rushed up to the cart and screamed, "Go down to hell with the curses of all the wives and mothers." When they reached the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, the guillotine was waiting. It was the same spot where Louis XVI had died. The cycle was complete. Robespierre was the last to die. He had to watch 21 of his friends beheaded. He had to hear the thud of the blade 21 times. He had to watch the dying, crippled Couthon be carried up the steps. He had to watch the severed head of Saint-Just fall into the basket. Finally, it was his turn. He climbed the steps unaided. The executioners were rough. They strapped him to the plank. But there was a problem. The bandage around his head, the one holding his jaw together, was in the way of the mechanism. Without a word of warning, the executioner reached down and violently ripped the bandage off. The pain must have been absolute, blinding, white, hot agony. The shattered jaw fell open. Maximilien Robespierre let out a scream, not a word, but a guttural animal roar of pain that echoed across the silent square. It was the only sound he had made since the shooting. It was a scream that seemed to contain all the horror, all the madness, and all the tragedy of the revolution. The blade fell. The scream was cut short. The executioner lifted the head. He showed it to the crowd, and then a roar went up, not of pain, but of joy. "Vive la République," they shouted. People hugged each other. Hats were thrown in the air. The monster was dead. The terror was over. In the days that followed, the men who killed Robespierre, the Thermidorians, scrambled to rewrite history. They had to wash the blood from their own hands, so they poured it all over Robespierre's memory. They painted him as a lone demon who had hijacked the revolution. They destroyed his reputation so thoroughly that for centuries his name was synonymous with tyranny. But the truth, as we have seen, is far more unsettling. Robespierre was not a demon. He was a man who began as a humanitarian, who fought for the poor, who believed in a world without kings and slaves. He was a man who loved his country with such a pure, burning intensity that he burned it to ash. He stands as the ultimate warning of the Enlightenment, that the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions. He showed the world that virtue, without compromise, can be just as deadly as vice. He proved that when a man believes he possesses the absolute truth, he gives himself the permission to do absolute evil. As the smoke cleared over Paris in the summer of 1794, the Republic survived, but the dream of a utopia of virtue died with Robespierre. The revolution would stumble on for a few more years, until a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte would pick up the crown from the gutter and place it on his own head. But in the quiet corners of history, the ghost of the lawyer from Arras still lingers. He asks us the uncomfortable question: how far would you go for what you believe is right? Would you execute a king? Would you sacrifice your best friend? Would you destroy your own humanity to save the world? Maximilien Robespierre answered yes to all three, and in the end, the world killed him for it.